Okay, I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Evren Balta, and I'm the director of TÜSİAD Global Politics Forum. And I'll be moderating this event with Soli Özel from Kadir Has University and a member of Academic Advising Committee of the TÜSİAD Global Politics Forum. As the Global Politics Forum, we are proud to host Ivan Krastev, one of the most influential thinkers of our time, who will be speaking about European politics and many more topics. Let me introduce Ivan Krastev to you very briefly. He is the chairman of the Center of the Liberal Strategies and permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences, IWM, Vienna. He is founding board member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Crisis Group. He was a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times between 2015 and 2021. And he is the author of many books. Is It Tomorrow Yet? How the Pandemic Changes Europe, his recent book. Before that, he wrote with Stephen Holmes, The Light That Failed, A Reckoning, which won the Lionel Galbraith Prize. And his other books are After Europe, Democracy Disrupted, The Global Politics on Protest, In Mistrust We Trust, Can Democracy Survive When We Don't Trust Our Leaders? Ivan Krastev, thank you so much for joining us today. It is an honor to be with you here today. We have so many questions and issues that we would like to discuss with you. But let me first remind you all some simple housekeeping rules first, and I'll direct you my first question. Welcome again. The event is going to be English as we've announced, but we are providing simultaneous translation. You'll see the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. And if you press on that button, you can listen to this conversation in Turkish simultaneously, which is a simultaneous translation. You can ask your questions throughout the event using Q&A section, and I'll be directing your questions to Ivan Krastev. So my first question to you is, a couple of months ago, we hosted Richard Haas right here before the Ukrainian invasion. And our question to him was whether the US is back in global politics as a major actor. And we also asked, and if so, doing what? So, and today, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, let me repeat the same question for Europe. Is Europe back in global politics? And if so, back to doing what? And also whether this newly found unity and purpose sustainable? Is this crisis a turning point for the better or the worse for Europe? So floor is yours, or screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And really, thank you very much for the invitation, for the opportunity. Listen, America is back and Europe is back is slightly different. Because when Americans said that they're back, it's very much about global leadership. For Europe, this crisis has a different question raised. The first is that some of the assumptions on which the European project have been based has been challenged by the war and by recent developments, not in general. I'll start with the most obvious. European Union is a project that felt quite comfortably in a globalized world. In a strange way, after the Cold War, after stopping to be both the most important power in the world, like at the end of the 19th century, or the central place of global politics, like during the Cold War, European Union tried to position itself as the laboratory of the world to come. So this idea of a postmodern politics with a shared sovereignty, very much based on economic interdependence, very much rejecting the importance of the military power as the way to solve issues and so on. It was very kind of at the heart of European project. So what is happening with the war in Ukraine, several things are changing, and they're changing for the world, but in a certain way, much more dramatically for the European Union. The first is, as Tony Judd has the title of his great history of Europe after 1945, European Union was post-war, and it was post-war in two different senses. It was post-war because it was a project very much built out of the ruins of the World War II, but it was a post-war also because it was based on the assumptions that a major war is not possible in Europe anymore. Europeans were not so naive to believe that war is not going to be possible anywhere. Europeans were not so naive to believe that some local conflicts are not going to be possible, but a kind of a serious war between states that we see now between Russia and Ukraine was the war we didn't expect to happen. So when something like this happens, it pushes you to say what is coming next. And normally when we speak about the future, we're changing our view of the future because we're changing our view of the past. By revisiting our past expectations is how we change our view of the future. And here is the three things that in my view, European Union is forced to revisit. One is our view on military power. Obviously, while the European Union is never going to become a military power in the way the United States or China are, you're going to see that Europe is going to invest much more in its defense capabilities. And this change is particularly dramatic for countries like Germany, which very identity was based on a civilian power. Secondly, European Union is preparing for the world which is going to be deglobalized in the way the world is, which is going to be more fragmented and polarized at the same time. So then European Union should try to see where it sees itself in this world, because Europe was very proud of being a regulatory power. But the strength of Europe as a regulatory power comes from the fact that Chinese and Americans should share the same regulations. If you're going to have an American zone and China zone, of course, nobody's going to be interested to regulate their own zone from outside. So all these are things that Europe are changing Europe. But one thing that came as a result of this war was not simply the unity of the states and their response to the Russian aggression, but much more the unity of the European public opinion, which was not the case before. Strangely enough, some of the previous divisions in Europe, at least for a short while, I don't believe that this unity is going to survive untouched in the way it is now, but it created this European moment in which governments were allowed to do things that otherwise they were not going to do. In my view, this is a strange story. Always before, governments were seeing the public opinion as a force that is not allowing them to do this and that. And this time it was the public opinion that pushed them to do things that otherwise probably they were not going to do. So let's stop here and we're going to have time to develop on several of
these. Okay. Ivan, thank you. I want to go back to your last book, actually, latest book, not last book. And that's the, Is It Tomorrow Yet? And in which you say the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic have been very paradoxical. At one and the same time, it encouraged deglobalization, but it also made everyone realize how globalized actually our existence in this world is. On the one hand, it pushed for renationalization of political economy, and then also made the realization that it is not really possible to do that as if we were even in the post-World War II period. Now, given that those were the trends that you identified before the war, did the war change anything? What remains of the lessons, the 7 lessons that you drew from the COVID-19 pandemic that still is there, reinforced or weakened after the war, after Russia invaded Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And if you go a century ago and you see the collapse of the first globalization, it was World War followed by pandemic. And now you have a war, we have a pandemic followed by war, which we hope is not going to be a world war anyway. But in the case of pandemic, what struck me back then was exactly the strange effect that obviously we had a level of deglobalization. On one level, basically the global supply chains have been shortened. People start talking about onshoring and basically trying to have the production close to them. At the same time, for several months, we have been really living in a common world. You can change the television channels, you go on any language that you want and you know what is in the news because everybody was talking only about the pandemic. And also you have this moment in which the borders were closed and then suddenly we understand how much we hate it. So some of this kind of paradoxical nature is still with us. For example, if you see this kind of response to the Russia's aggression in Ukraine, on one level, this is a very European moment, but on the other side, this is a moment in which you have a very strong national mobilization and national reactions. It's polls are very much about Poland when they're responding to this. Politics are very much about also their national sentiment. So this strange story in which if before European identity was very much perceived in a contrast to national identity, suddenly enough, these national identities are mobilizing this European moment. And this I found very much continuing
Why do you think that happened? I mean, Julia Ioffe argues or suggests that it's because war was unthinkable, as you said at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And that it happened suddenly shocked everyone when you realized it.
But also this is suddenly you realize that you're a member of a community of faith. Listen, suddenly what people, but also companies starting to realize in the world is that you have a passport and you cannot forget which is your passport. There was a moment in which basically people have been living in an idea of you can have as much cosmopolitan identity as you want, but in the moment of crisis, basically your passport starts to matter. For example, it matters for the Russians, even those living out of Russia. Suddenly you realize that you're part of this community and you know wear certain responsibility for what your government is doing. It matters for the companies because basically being a Western company also means that expectations is to behave in a certain way. And this kind of a sense of identity and belonging comes back. But then suddenly you realize that this time it's not about you only. It's not about Poland versus Russia. This is about Europe. This is about the Western world. And in my, this kind of ambiguity is there because also strangely enough, this war is bringing back the three crises that shattered Europe in the previous 10 years. First of all, the global financial crisis. Listen, the economic implications of this war are going to be dramatic. We probably are going to see recession, if not this year, next year. Of course, there's going to be inflation. They're going to be a major kind of economic consequences, very asymmetrical for different countries. But comparing with what was the reaction of Europe to the economic crisis 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you're going to see that this time we go in a totally different way. It started with the pandemic, it continues now. During global financial crisis, the key word was fiscal responsibility, keep the rules. Now the idea is you should spend, you should try to keep the social cohesion. This is much more important. Then you have the return of the refugee crisis. There are twice more refugees coming as a result of the Ukrainian war to Europe than during the Syrian war. And paradoxically, first, they're totally differently welcomed. And by the way, welcomed exactly by the countries who during the refugee crisis said that they don't want to see a single migrant. And now you have Poland with 3 million people, which probably per capita is higher than Turkey has. And also the relations is very different. So this is also totally. And certainly there was this first Russian-Ukrainian war of 2014, 2015, where Europeans believes that you can basically buy Russia in. You can give them something. You can basically normalize. We should not go hysterical. Okay, they do this and that. And now suddenly, the position is not simply that this cannot be tolerated. We want to isolate Russia for a long time. Strangely enough, unlike after the end of the Cold War, nobody talks so much about the prospect of a different Russia, democratic Russia, and so on. But many people talk about Russia in the way we're talking about the Chernobyl reactor, something basically to be shielded for the next 2000 years. So how good is this policy is different, but I'm just trying to make clear to what extent every crisis coming in Europe basically is totally revisited and reformulated.
So what everybody writes, the end of history moment.
I'm sorry?
The end of history moment.
Oh yeah, totally. No. If there is a consensus on something, is the end of history moment, and this is why Germany is in such a difficult position, because as our colleague and friend Thomas Bagger once said, the end of history was an American book, but a German reality.
Yeah, perfect.
Maybe I can I can ask something. I mean, based on what you said in terms of remilitarization of Europe and the changes in the patterns and beliefs of war making. And we know that war is a major mechanism of social change. When patterns of war change, it changes societies. Nation states came out of, European nation states came out of war making. Welfare states have been shaped by war making and so on and so forth. And in fact, Charles Tilly once said that it's hardly worth asking when European states warred. When they warred, because they were warring all the time in the 19th century, 20th century. But it seems to me that what changed in the last 50, 60 years, this war aversion, right? The European societies, European states didn't want to make war. And populations do not want to fight. They don't want to die in wars. They don't want to pay for wars. And war making for the governments probably will make you lose elections. But then you face leaders like Putin, who are willing to go to war. And war making is maybe not that much costly for them. They don't experience re-election anxiety. They control information. They have more nationalistic populations and so on and so forth. So I'm asking whether this war aversion, even though they're right now militarizing, is a major disadvantage of the West, or other societies like Russia, for example, will eventually follow their footsteps and war became absolute. I mean, I'm asking a very general question, but I think this mechanism of war and how you see war as a mechanism really makes a lot of difference. And when you compare this to different mentalities, there is a huge difference, it seems to me.
Totally. And listen, it's interesting because even in the case of Russia, we don't know to what extent Russian population is in a sacrificial mood. Mm-hmm. Because if you see the annexation of Crimea and basically this high mobilization, patriotic mobilization in Russia, all these people had this type of a mobilization, which is typical for the football fans. But football fans never go to play football. In a certain way, you are the audience of your state, you are the audience of your leader, and you like it because there is no need somebody to be killed. You're just getting it as a gift. Now you see in the opinion polls quite a lot of support on the Russian side for the war, but I don't see many people volunteering in the army. And this is the different story. Even in Russia, we don't know. And in the case of Europe, it's even stronger because while we understand that something is changing, I just saw unpublished results of the opinion poll that ECFR did. The majority of people in Europe still don't believe that we should increase military budgets. So this cultural change that comes probably is not happened because there was this great book called Where Has All Soldiers Go? The major cultural transformation of Europe was this transformation to a post-heroic culture. The interesting thing about Ukraine was that suddenly these post-heroic European societies simply admired the act of heroism on the case of the Ukrainians. Because we should be very clear on this. Position of Europe with respect to Russia after this war was provoked not so much by the Russian aggression, but by the Ukrainian resistance. If Ukrainians were not fighting back, if basically Kiev was going to be captured in 1 or 2 weeks, if the Ukrainians were not ready to die, I don't believe that Europe was going to get as hard position, or even if the governments were going to get a harder position, I'm not sure that publics were going to be there. But it was this fact that these post-heroic societies were suddenly in admiration of heroism and readiness of people to die, particularly after the COVID, going back to Soli's question, where death was declared almost unnatural. And then you have the people who said, for my country, for my independence, I'm ready to die. This made Europeans moved. Probably it reminded them of the history of their own nations, which was also interestingly, this is kind of inspiring, not of the leader, but of the latecomer to a certain period. But this explains the fact that normally European development in the last 30 years in the end of history period can be described like European Union flags appearing somewhere, being in a protest demonstration in 2004 in Ukraine or in the Balkans. This is the opposite. Now the Ukrainian flag is back in Europe. Suddenly the Ukrainian flag became the European flag for many people because this is the flag for which people are ready to die. And in my view, this is an interesting story. And I don't know how far this will go. There are good reasons, at least in my view, to believe that European societies are also admiring the Ukrainians. It does not mean that we're going to behave like them in a situation like this. But this was a kind of also cultural challenge. They're ready to die for something. They see the meaning of what is happening. What about us?
One follow-up question about that. Earlier you said in our private conversation, it's not about how much pain you are going to inject, but how much pain you are going to endure. This thing that you said about the Europeans really reminded me that conversation, how much the Europeans are going to endure. I mean, do you see a European resilience in that sense, in the way that they are reacting to this conflict, to this invasion?
Listen, the pain has not come yet. And how we are going to respond is difficult to predict. Consumer societies are not famous for liking pain. On the other side, my feeling is that Europeans are starting to understand that if you're not ready to fight, if you're ready to use economic weapon is not simply how much pain you can inject on others. It's really how much pain you're ready basically to sustain. And this is going to be interesting. And there are political leaders, at least in my view, who are starting to realize it. Also, and in my view, this is very true for Habeck and for the German Greens, suddenly Europeans understood that anyway, the change of Europe cannot be business as usual. We tried it several times with the small reforms of here and there, that there should be a moment in which the public and the elite should be on the same page. Because the problem of Europe was always that it was an elite project and everybody was dreaming about the publics coming in. But after every crisis, even if we agree that Europe didn't do particularly bad during the COVID and so on, the trust in the political leadership did not increase. And this is for the first time that it was public pushing the governments to do things that normally you're going to perceive as totally unpopular. For example, the majority of Europeans, the major majority in almost all of the member states are asking for supplying weapons, cutting energy relations with Russia. Listen, this is not for free. I don't know to what extent people are understanding what are the long-term consequences of these policies, but for the first time, you have this militant public opinion. And in my view, some of the political leaders in Europe decided that this is the moment you use it to transform the union. Is it going to succeed or not? As I told you, it's an open page. Predict how it's going to do is very difficult, particularly because we don't know many things. We don't know how the war is going to develop. We don't know when it is going to end. We don't know the events. And at the end of the day, the events are shaping what is going on.
Ivan, we speak about the war as a global affair. The rest of the non-white or non-Western world does not seem to share that view of the war. In a way, it appears like Europe's or America's past or history is catching up with them, and they have a hard time convincing the rest of the world that Russia is an aggressor and it has to be given both a lesson. So if that is the case, how do you recompose the world order? How do you restructure it? What will be the main tenets? And how can you convince others that this was a global assault rather than an intra-civilizational or intra-white war?
Listen, I do believe we're failing to do this. Also, I don't believe that we're going to succeed to make others basically share it. Others are going, of course, to be affected by this. They're going to be affected because of the food crisis, because of the energy crisis. But at the end of the day, and this is an interesting story, if you listen the way we're trying to basically frame this crisis, we're framing it very much in a frame of the Cold War. You have the authoritarian Russian states attacking a young democracy. But suddenly, the majority of the countries that President Biden invited on the Summit of Democracies are not sanctioning. Exactly for the reasons that they see this as a Western affair. And of course, they don't sympathize particularly with President Putin, but they don't see this as their war. So what this is telling us about the future order? In my view, the problem of the future order is it's going to have two characteristics which are different from each other. One is fragmentation. As you see, this war is extremely important for those in Europe, probably also to some extent to the United States, because this is about their region. This is basically about their regional order. And this is not particularly interested for other countries which are not part of it. Then all this is combined with a certain level of a geopolitical polarization, particularly between the United States and China, which others are really kind of aware of around, but they see both United States and China as being part and players in their regional order than participating in some type of a global order that is sharing the same norms and sensitivities. For example, the Indians are interested in their relations with the United States when it comes to Asia, but they're not interested in their relations with the United States when it comes to Europe or Russia. Japanese and South Koreans are joining Americans and Europeans when it comes to Ukraine, but obviously keeping in mind what is happening in their part of the world. So in my view, we're going to have much more the future of international order as a kind of a constellation of interrelated regional orders. And of course, Asia is going to be the predominant one. And the clash between the Americans and the Chinese is going to be very much about the hegemony in Asia than about the global hegemony. And this is going to be a kind of an easy relationship because we cannot blame others for reacting like this. In the way the war in Syria never became the European war, in the way this was the war in Ukraine, we should not be then surprised that for Saudis or for Egyptians and others, the war in Ukraine is not as important for them.
But how, I mean, there is a question before we get to that, let me say just a follow-up thing. Europe, you're suggesting, one, may not sustain this unity and determination for long. I've also heard you say that. Secondly, who is going to be responsible for leadership to move Europe in a certain direction, especially when you have small countries such as Hungary that are blocking things and going against the grain of the European Union. Finally, if it is still going to be the United States and NATO will be the primary organization of the Western Alliance from now on, how can we count on stability in American policies? You say somewhere in your book that every election in the United States looks like a regime-changing election to the rest of the world. I mean, you move from Obama to Trump, you move from Trump to Biden, and God knows where you're going to move from Biden. And therefore, the most powerful country for the moment in the world is not predictable any longer. And what does that do both to Europe and to world order in general?
Listen, all this is a great question, and I have much more guesses than answers. On the unity, for sure, unity is not going to be sustained on the long term on the level in which it is. But always, the cost of dissent in Europe these days is quite high because economic crisis and other crises are really pushing countries to go to the financial resources and cooperation they can get only from Europe. For example, and Hungary is a great example because in a certain way, Hungary wanted to have a hard line and Prime Minister Orban easily got re-elected, but in order to get re-elected, he spent around 10 billion euro. And now the money should come. And what is probably going to change in Europe is that because of this crisis and because of the existential nature of this security crisis, there are going to be countries who said, we're not going to tolerate anymore this level of anonymous decision-making in which a single country can block everybody. And you're going to end up with a coalition of willing and kind of a deepening of integration by the way you're changing your decision-making, by agreeing that you're going to get rid of your veto in certain policy areas. And this is going to be important because comparing to any other crisis this time, it's going to be easy for people to say, probably this is the way to go. And every country should decide and to make a choice. Because this is not anymore about the Western Europe being the core and Eastern Europe being the periphery. It's very much how you're defining your sovereignty within the European Union. And this is not going to be easy, but I do believe we're moving in a direction like this, and this is going to be based on very type of concrete policies. And then you're asking the story about the United States. Listen, when the Germans decided to invest 100 billions in their defense, in my view, there were 3 reasons for this. The first and more obvious was the threat from Russia. And you look around and you said, okay, we didn't believe that there's going to be a major war, but then we should be prepared. But the second was, what if the United States, after their next elections, are going simply to say we're not interested in Europe, or we're not interested to talk to Europeans even when we're doing something in Europe, what we're going to do. And then the idea of European sovereignty and autonomy is taking a different meaning. In a certain way, you don't want it, but you should hedge, because this is not unthinkable. And this is very difficult to be in a major partnership and alliance with a country in which all its major newspapers have on cover page that it is a country in a civil war. So this is, but the third also, suddenly Germans realized that probably they don't want to buy arms. But in the next 5 years, these European armies are going to be rearmed and modernized and weaponized because they gave all the old Soviet weapons to the Ukrainians, and now they were promised to have a really high quality American weapons. So strangely, this also changed configurations, in my view, very important, because some even of the old divisions that are still there, for example, East-West division is still there. Poles and Baltics are very critical to Germany and France. They're very much blaming them for the failure of European Russia policy. But at the same time, this is not anymore simply the blame coming from the resentment of being lectured here and there. This is very much based on the fact that we suddenly realize that in a world which is much more shaped by the dissolution of the former European empires than by the end of the Cold War and the end of communism, these countries have different sensibilities. Most of the Western countries were former empire. European Union was founded by either former or still existing empires back then, while also East Europeans were former colonies. In a certain way, this was the countries that get their independence at the end of the dissolution. So the idea of sovereignty, the idea of future, very different. For example, even now, when talk about Russia, East Europeans fear occupation. West Europeans fear nuclear war. And this kind of renegotiations of sensitivities, renegotiations of identities, this is going to be much more central to the European project than simply renegotiations of economic policies and institutions.
Okay. Evren?
Okay, yeah, there are several questions that I'm checking. There are 2 more, but let me ask the first 2 in the order that they came. The first question is about softening of illiberal practices in Europe, for example, towards migrants, refugees, and this and that, and maybe more emphasis on democracy. And the question is about whether this change in attitude towards democracy, democratic norms, is going to be affecting the authoritarian leaders or the possibility of them to stay in power. So whether these regimes are going to be changing as a result of the changes in the European practices or softening of illiberal practices in Europe. The second question is about the US power. And the question asks whether the US is using this war as an opportunity to weaken Russia. This is a question that we have been asked over and over, not just in Turkey, but globally as well. And it's and I want to add something to that question about the concept of anti-Westernism, maybe, or anti-Americanism, which really sort of shaping the attitude in the non-Western societies, basically towards Russia. and making them to align more with Russia. And in the context of anti-Westernism, maybe we can really differentiate anti-Westernism from anti-Americanism. But here, in this case, where we see the interests, identities of Americans and Europeans merging together against Russia, maybe fueling more and more anti-Westernism. I mean, Europe used to be more critical of American power in the 1990s, more of a normative look, less militarized in a sense. So it really is this balancing effect in terms of anti-Westernism. So is this going to be changing? I mean, how do you see the role of that? Sorry.
Thank you very much. Let's go with the first question. Listen, when I was said that basically the historical trajectories of West European countries and East European countries were different, it was very much based on the fact that if you are coming from certain imperial past, your view on ethnic cultural diversity is much more benevolent. In a certain way, this was your state, and even if there is imperial nostalgia, this is a nostalgia for kind of some type of a much more multicultural, diverse society that has disappeared. Joseph wrote, one of the great kind of authors of the Habsburg Empire, was so much missing this cosmopolitan milieu that comes with the empire that after the dissolution of Habsburg Empire, he was spending a lot of time in the lobbies of the big hotels in Europe, believing that the lobbies of the big hotels was the last Habsburg empires remaining, where people come from different parts and they speak different languages and so on. This was his world that has disappeared. For East Europeans, basically, minorities and diversities were perceived as a threat. So if you see the history of Europe in the 20th century, people like to say that people have been moving. People have been moving, but they have been moving for the person of unmixing and not for the purpose of mixing. In the beginning of the 20th century, Central and Eastern Europe was culturally the most diverse part of Europe, and West Europeans were much more ethnically homogeneous. At the end of the 20th century, it was just the opposite. Destruction of the Jews, expulsion of the Germans, and as a result of it, most of East European states have become very much ethnically homogeneous states. What is changing now is that first East Europeans, we started traveling ourselves. We start out migrating. And it created a trauma, but also this created a different cultural experience. And suddenly now we open selectively for refugees and immigration. But remember, the problem with migration is it's always selective. Nevertheless, how we're going to define the selection, but you're not equally open to everybody. But now, in the 1950s, Poland was busy of expelling the Ukrainians, basically. Now this is very much welcoming them in the way basically you're welcoming one of your own. So this is going to change part of the language of the liberal regimes, and also particularly in the case of Poland and Hungary, while these two countries were very much backing each other against Brussels when it comes to the rule of law, when it comes to sovereignty, when it comes to their Russia policies, they're on the opposite sides. And while they still try to find a way to support each other, you can see that societies are becoming nervous, particularly the Poles. They don't understand how it's possible that Hungarians to do this to them, how it is possible for Orban to attack Zelensky. I'm saying this because it very much goes to your second question. It's about America. And here, I have been following the developing of this crisis quite closely and talking to a lot of people. And there is one thing in which I'm convinced, and I'm convinced that for their own geopolitical reasons, the United States really wanted to prevent this war from happening. America was so much about focusing on China. America was so much believing that they're too much distracted, that they wanted basically to park Russia, as they want to say, to basically reduce the relations with Russia, but at the same time to be able to concentrate and to make alliances about China. So even when they were coming to Europe before the war, Americans wanted to talk China. They were not interested to talk Russia. And when President Biden went to meet in Geneva, President Putin, obviously his message was, listen, you're not the most important for us. let's find a way of coexistence. We're not in the regime change mode. And all American policies, even their readiness to discuss some of the missile defense system and so on, were going into this direction. And then Americans failed to prevent this war. It was clear that they're not going to militarily participate. They used this very aggressive declassifying of intelligence. They tried to threaten Russians with the cost of the economic sanctions, but the war happened. After the war happened, America is about weakening Russia and weakening Russia's capacities. But where people are making a mistake, basically taking causation and chronology wrong. In the way that expansion of NATO cannot be the reason for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, because first Soviet Union should disintegrate in order for NATO to start to enlarge. In the same way, the fact that now Americans really are going on a policy of trying to reduce Russia's capacity does not mean that they wanted this war and that basically this is why they started it. Otherwise, I really do believe that this is the American policy, trying to isolate and very much weaken the capacity of Russia. And also for the Americans, what is happening in the Russian-Ukrainian war is also to try to send a signal to China, because China continues to be their major priority. So they're using this crisis first to try to show China how high can be the cost of certain type of military actions in Taiwan, but secondly, to try to tell China how important is American economic weapon, particularly weaponizing the position of the West into international financial institutions. How this is going to work is a different story, but from this point of view, yes, it's fair to say that now the American policy is about weakening Russia in a long term. But no, I don't believe that basically Americans were interested in this war, or they basically encouraged the war for the purpose of weakening Russia. In my view, this was not where they were going. This became a default option after the war started.
Soli, if you don't have a follow-up question, there are two more questions that I'll be directing coming from the audience. And the first two questions somehow close to each other. So I'm gonna be combining two of them on one question. And it's basically about the Cold War, whether this is a new Cold War, one of our guests is asking. And one other guest is also asking that given that this is a Cold War-like structure, whether you can, and whether the European power is going to be more resilient based on that idea, more unified, resilient, and this reaction of Europe is going to be more sustainable since it's sort of a Cold War structure. So that's the two questions. And the third question is about Sweden's and Finland's decision to join NATO. And the question is, what triggered Sweden's and Finland's desire to join NATO, and how Europeans pursue Turkey's veto of their membership? So,
yeah, both questions are very interesting. Let's start on the Cold War. I do believe President Biden was very eager to frame this in terms of the return of the Cold War, because Cold War means global alliances, ideological alliances, and for sure, China and Russia are authoritarian powers. But communism was a universalist ideology that was trying to transform the world. So from this point of view, there is a difference between basically being a country or empire that try to transform the world because you believe in the future, and basically being an empire that tries to rule the world or try to be the most influential there. From this point of view, I don't believe that we can simply go back to the Cold War, and there's three reasons, at least in my view, for this. One is that while we talk a lot about the clash between democracy and authoritarianism, in my view, the defining problem of our time is not the rise of authoritarianism or decline of democracy, but the big gray zone between democracy and authoritarianism. Some of the most important countries you're not easily going to define in these terms. To be honest, Turkey, India, are part of this conversation. So as a result of it, these countries and their behavior are not going to be, foreign policy behavior is not going to be defined by the nature of regime predominantly. It does not mean that their domestic politics is not going to play a role, but they're going to be other things. Secondly, Cold War was preconditioned on the existing and total total unity between the economic spheres of influence and geopolitical and security sphere of influences. Warsaw Pact was not simply a military alliance, it was also a common economic space. And from this point of view, Warsaw Pact and NATO, they didn't trade much with each other. Everybody has their own trade bloc, everybody's was kind of confined to their trade bloc. And while we're going to see certain decoupling between China and the United States for sure, and we're already seeing this, particularly on the level of technology, I don't believe that in a certain way, we are going to have the world that can be totally decoupled. The nature of the economy, the nature of the communication, the nature, for example, of the data flows, which is very different than the nature of the flow of goods and others, are done in the way that we're much more independent than we have been during the Cold War. So then the return to a classical Cold War in which you have two camps and then contain each other, then much more communicating is not true. And secondly, authoritarianism is not an ideology. Communism was. Communism was about nationalizing industry. This was against the private property. It was something that has a kind of a common position. There are people who don't like democracy. There's certain people who believe that they like a democracy because they have been elected, but they don't like to go for new elections. So all this is going to be much more of a variety of systems. So I expect that while the difference between democracies and authoritarianism are going to be critically important when we try to describe where the country can go in a long term. This is not going to be enough to know how the countries are going to side in different conflicts or how actively they're going to be involved. And then you go to the Finland-Sweden story, and this is a very interesting story because one of the major kind of impact of the Russia's war in Ukraine was that suddenly neutrality does not make sense anymore. By the way, it started with the fact that neutral Switzerland sanctioned Russian assets because you cannot be, exactly because the world is so interconnected, you cannot be neutral. And also neutrality does not make any more sense because you don't know exactly what it is. And the polarizing effect of the war is very important. And I do believe that President Putin, while he was talking about the new European architecture, he didn't understand that in a certain way, his war was very much producing a new European architecture in which now the border between NATO and Russia is enlarged by 1,500 kilometers. So how this is going to work? And where basically Turkey stay in all this? Listen, at least for the moment, and we could be wrong, most Europeans believe that Turkey is much more in a kind of a trading mood, using the fact of its leverage in order to achieve different things. Most of the people believe that this is kind of putting pressure, not simply on the Kurdish parties in Sweden and others, but very much also using the fact in order to go to Syria and so on and to get a license for tougher policies towards the Kurds, nevertheless, where they are. I have my own hypothesis, which is not based on much. So I'll be happy for two of you basically to disagree. But also I do believe that because President Erdogan goes into election period, this election period is going to be very contested. There's certain kind of fears and speculations that in this moment you try to do certain things that probably your Western partners are not going to be particularly happy with. He's going to keep basically the ratification for Finland and Sweden to happen after the election. So this is going to give him leverage when he's talking to the West. So this is much more about leveraging and trying to achieve other things. But probably you know better, probably he simply don't want this country. Probably this goes to try to show his importance and also the importance of his relationship with President Putin, because if his veto is effective, then of course, how the results and the outcomes of the war looks totally different, because Turkey vetoing Sweden and Finland in this situation very much define Turkey as a NATO state in a much more metaphorical way, basically not sharing the security concerns of most of the other member states.
Soli, we have too many questions, but if you have a comment, or shall I go ahead?
Yeah, you should.
Okay.
But listen, I'm much more interested in your view.
Okay, so we have 5 questions, and they're quite different, so let me group them. And the first group of questions is about the Turkey in Europe, maybe you can say. And Shafak Göktürk, for example, asks whether beyond its geographic and military significance, how relevant is Turkey for the East European nations now? And also there is another question. I'm sorry now. Okay, let me see that. A few days ago, French president proposed European Political Society for Ukraine's membership, which is different and looser formation than the European Union. The question asks. And I don't read the name, but do you believe that this organization could also appeal to Turkey, which is Turkey's not being accepted as a full member, but given that Turkey is not accepted as a full member to the EU, and this sort of may be related to this differentiated integration debates around Turkey's membership. Oh, okay, this question is by Mehmet Bardakçı. So these are 2 questions regarding to the role of Turkey in the EU for the EU. So
yeah, thank you very much. And basically, listen, of course, Turkey could be extremely important for Europe, at least at 3 levels. Now, when we have this kind of at least partial deglobalization, and everybody's talking not about only onshoring, but friendshoring, you want to basically move many of your productions that before it had been in places like China and others to places which are closer to Europe, but where you have a younger population, where you have kind of a well-developed industrial base. And Turkey fits very well. Unlike many of the East European countries, basically Turkish population is much younger and the scale of the Turkish possibility for Turkish production is much bigger. This goes under the idea that Turkey basically is going to be perceived by the Europeans being strongly in the European camp. And for the moment, to be honest, this is not so clear. The Turkish government so much try to show that their sovereignty also means to show not simply the capacity to negotiate with non-Western powers, but also to show that they can easily violate the interests of some of their key allies. So from this point of view, in my view, very much is going to depend on the domestic political process in Turkey. What Europeans believe is happening in the country, in which direction the country go. Is Europe is more important for Turkey, or Turkey perceives itself much more as a kind of a Euro-based but Middle Eastern power. And of course, this goes again to the problem of what's going to happen to European Union. There was a good joke, which I always like to talk about. What is the difference between the optimists and pessimists when it comes to the enlargement of the European Union to the Western Balkans? And the optimist is a person who believes that Turkey is going to join during the Albanian presidency. And the pessimist is a person who believes that Albania is going to join during the Turkish presidency. I'm saying this because in the way the European Union is now, with this mechanism of decision-making, big and important countries with their very strong agenda like Turkey, but also Ukraine, are not easy to be integrated. So in my view, this is a reality. At the same time, European Union, particularly in the world that European Union thinks much more in terms of Europe's sovereignty and autonomy and hedging against certain negative developments in the United States, Europe needs not simply the productive and the military power of Turkey, but simply needs the scale. And this is absolutely the same with Ukraine. So from this point of view, if European Union is going to be transformed in a kind of a much more looser political community in which some of the countries still very much insist keeping their sovereignty on certain type of an issues, but are ready to follow certain norms of behavior, and particularly of the relations between themselves and on the democratic process and others, while some other group countries are really ready to get rid of their vetoes on certain policy areas, I do believe that Turkey can easily be part of this community if Turkey is interested to be. And this is a question. Is Turkey interested to be? To what extent Turkey basically believes it's going to do better on its own? In my view, these are questions that should be solved in a domestic political process in Turkey. This is not something that Europe can sell. But if you're going to ask me, compared with 6 months ago, are Europeans more eager to get Turkey in? I would say yes. Because Europe at this moment is losing Russia. There was a lot of people in Europe that believed with the passing of time, with the modernization of Russia, Russia is going to be integrated not as a member of European Union, but being part at least of a bigger European economic space. And now breaking economic relations with Russia is pushing Europe to look around and basically to look for new opportunities and try to kind of also for new allies.
Oh, okay. There is this just in from Deniz Bingöl Hall, and she says that Orban just declared state of emergency due to war in neighboring Ukraine, allows government to bypass parliament. And this is not a question, but something about emergency powers and how war is related to the use of emergency powers.
Can I make a point on this? Because this is a very interesting point. Listen, Prime Minister Orban does not need to declare a state of emergency because he had a constitutional majority and total control over the parliament. So from this point of view, he can vote anything that he wants. And from this point of view, if you're declaring the state of emergency, it's to mobilize the population, not so much about the war in Ukraine, where, as you know, Hungary is not particularly active, but much more to signal to Brussels that he's in a war mood, if his money are going to be cut and if he's not going to get the recovery. From this point of view, it's a symbolic politics totally deprived of any type of a political meaning, because normally you go with a state of emergency in order to get powers that otherwise you don't have. He had it. And by the way, he did the same during the COVID period. And the result was that Hungary was one of the countries that has the worst results when you look at the level of the excess deaths. So this is much more symbolic politics. You're playing Carl Schmitt just to show how you feel about the situation than because you need kind of emergency powers.
Soli?
Yeah.
Should we continue?
Go ahead. Ivan, I tend to think this war and the results that it triggered as a constitutive moment. It's fragile, that this moment is fragile. But if we're going to talk about the European security structure being rebuilt, recomposed, restructured, whatever, then it is a constitutive moment. Therefore, it is not possible, in my judgment, to look at the Russia-Ukraine war as just a regional problem. And this is in response to your analysis of what Turkey may or may not want. My sense is that if we don't treat this moment as a constitutive moment and war being part of that, then Turkey, even if the Europeans are more eager to take Turkey in, and I really don't know what that means, and I don't know how serious you are when you say that, that Turkey will find itself insulated, not just isolated, but insulated. And honestly, I really don't think that however autonomous you may wish to behave in your foreign policy, acting alone is going to be possible for even the major actors. In fact, we see this even with the United States, which is in dire need of building alliances, alignments in Asia, and if you were strengthening its European ties as well. In that sense, leveraging Sweden and Finland after you have told them that you would be welcoming them like you welcomed every other enlargement, seems to me a big risk, because it may indeed lead the Europeans to turn to actually walk around Turkey rather than walk alongside Turkey. I was wondering if there is a debate on that in Europe.
Listen, in Europe, the debate is going to start because this is too recent. And there was quite a lot of mistrust to certain type of movements of the Turkish foreign policy even before it. So from this point of view, I very much agree with you on the following. If it is a constitutive moment, the biggest risk is to try to play very well the game of yesterday.
Yeah.
If the game has changed, be sure that at least you know what is the game in town. And from this point of view now, Turkey was quite successful, leveraging itself by being involved in many crises, playing different roles, and basically picking up different partners. So it was very much against classical marriage and alliances, where basically the policy was. But if now European Union is really going to reconstitute itself, Turkey is in a position to be one of the constitutive members of this broader political community because Turkey is important. So from this point of view, this is like after the World War II, where Turkey basically came from a different position, but they decided that there is a game for them and it went to the West, it went to NATO, regardless of the fact that its war history was not exactly the history of the other players. Or Turkey can decide that this is the end of the West, this is the end of NATO, and basically we're going to play on its own. But then if you're playing on its own, be prepared to kind of lose on your own. And for me, this is a story, and this is a story of how you see the world. It's also going very much to go how you're interpreting what is happening, both in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, what is happening in European societies, what is happening in other places, because there was a moment, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, where people said, oh, this is the Chinese moment. It was not simply like Trump was insisting the Chinese virus, but it was the Chinese moment. And then suddenly you see that this kind of a strong authoritarian, effective authoritarian power does not help. And China continues to be closed because of COVID and paying a high economic price for this. Because otherwise, if they're going to change policies, then the government should confess that they were wrong. And this is the thing that kind of authoritarian governments cannot do. The charm of democracy is not that it comes with a better government. The charm of democracy is that you can be a weak government and still to be legitimate. And this is what is, in my view, totally missing in the authoritarian game. And the second kind of a blow to authoritarianism was the Russian military performance. It is not simply that what the Russians did were morally outraged. I do believe people were also shocked by the fact how ineffective Russian military action was. So this is the moment in which when people are talking about the decay of the West, the decline of democracies, I don't see incredible effectiveness on the other side. And this is where I do believe also for the Turkish and for the European debaters, do we read the global trends the same way?
Probably not. But you see, if I may, Evren, on your fifth conclusion on is it tomorrow yet? You say we started with trust in science and technology, but this was also the time when the most outrageous conspiracy theories have proliferated. So you can go in two different directions. In fact, that particular result, I argue, I would say, you're suggesting the end of rationality. We no longer live in a Cartesian world. Therefore, it's very possible to actually interpret and misinterpret at the same time, although your interests or your objectively your conditions necessitate that you look at the world in a similar way.
Very much agreeing with you. The fragmentation is not simply happening on a geopolitical level. We have a very strong fragmentation on the level of society. We are not living in the same society. This is best seen in a very polarized society like, for example, the United States. They're not sharing the same world. It is not that basically you share facts and you differ because of your values. You simply are living in a different worlds. And from this point of view, we're moving in a world in which social cohesion is very difficult to be regained. We are going to be much more in managing this kind of unbalanced worlds in which we are autistic and kind of hysterical at the same time.
But then how come you are still the founder and manager or the director of Center for Liberal Strategies.
Listen, liberalism, of course, hope that there is a common space and rational conversation. But even when we recognize that basically people can go insane, you believe that at least you can try to negotiate. And I'm saying this because at some point you're going to negotiate it between these worlds. And from this point of view, war is one of the realities that you cannot ignore. Because President Putin was living in a world in which basically Russia was as powerful as the United States and China. And then he entered basically Ukraine, and we know that his world was not exactly the way the world is. And for me, this kind of the fact, you cannot totally ignore reality. You can ignore reality for a while. I still remember 2003 when some American commentators were saying to the Europeans, oh, you're just commenting on the world, we're creating it before you're creating it. But after that, basically, the reality fights back. And from this point of view, there is a reality. And I do believe that this is an interesting story. And when Evren started with the idea of peace, Michael Howard, the great British military historian, he made a point which I found very important. He said, war is a very ancient phenomenon, but the peace is a modern invention. Peace is not simply the absence of war. And from this point of view, this was Europe about. Europe was not simply about the absence of war. It was peace about a different way of organizing the world, different way to go with different conflicts and others. And the funny story is that we moved from ideological politics that was typical for the Cold War framework to identity politics, which is very much about this. What is identity politics? I was shocked to see to what extent the metaphor of mirror is popular these days. So Finnish, for example, president was saying, if President Putin wants to understand why we want to get into NATO, let's look at the mirror. And President Putin insisting that he's putting the mirror in front of the West with his actions in order to see who they are. So this type of mirror and mirroring, this is at the core of identity politics. Quite often states are doing things just to show to the world who they believe they are. So this is not so different than basically the identity politics that we see in the campuses of universities. And this world is not easy to be organized, because this world is going to be driven and should be organized much more through kind of psychological terms than a classical realist terms. And the power, for example, of President Zelensky to influence European public opinion. Listen, you cannot explain this in the realist theory.
You can't.
The realist theory, you should talk only to your own society, and then suddenly he's basically changing German politics, he's changing other things. So this is why I do believe we're going to see something that is new. And we should be curious and open what this new thing is.
Yeah, about that, now there is a question just following what you have what you said about identity politics. And I also want to add to that question the concept of victimhood, maybe. Something you also mentioned in the podcast that you did with Ezra Klein, I guess. You said that the powerful wants to be perceived as the most vulnerable. And that's what Russia is basically doing, using identity politics and presenting itself as the most vulnerable. NATO expansion and this and that, Russia is under threat. And the question we have here from the audience, from Emre Metin Bilginer, he asks, in your book, After Europe, you have mentioned that threatened majorities expressed their fear that they were becoming losers of globalization. Again, this idea of victimhood, maybe. In the light of multiple crises, how do you analyze the sustainability of quiet fear of majorities?
Yes, I very much believe that threatened majorities are the most important factor in at least European and American politics. And here is the charm. Normally, minorities were envying majorities. And suddenly you basically have majorities which start to envy minorities, because a majority starts to believe that minorities has a very hard identities, they know who you are. But because if you're the victim, you have the right to do anything. You can be ruthless. And this is a strange story in which you want everything. You want basically to be perceived as the most vulnerable in order to be allowed to use most power. And this kind of a competition, Olympics of victimhood, everybody trying to show that you're the biggest victim of history. It was never worse to anybody. But why you want this? Not because you want basically others to realize how bad it is, but then to be ready to justify anything that you're doing. Listen, imagine for the moment, I'm not sharing particularly this view, but imagine for the moment that Russians are totally right. And the NATO expansion was unfair, it was a mistake. Does it give them the right to destroy the country of Ukraine? This is the interesting story that we're not simply kind of going for the victimhood because we want some kind of an identity, but also because it allows us in moral terms to cross borders. And these transgressive majorities, they're threatened, but also transgressive. They're threatened, but because they see themselves as a future minorities, you believe that you can change anything. I was always giving this joke with the title of Frank Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. Okay, the end of history is over, but many ethnic groups and many states behave as if they're populated by the last man. If you're not going to win now, you're never going to win. If basically your ethnic group is not going to preserve its power, it's over. And this kind of a determined fatalism in which you're the ultimate victim and because of it you have the right of everything, this unfortunately in my view is one of the most dangerous trends, which at least I see.
Maybe a follow-up question to that. I mean, in one of your books, I don't remember which one, or one of your articles, you're basically juxtaposing these two imaginations about the future, saving life, climate change, and this and that, and how to control that, which is mostly a Western European ideal or imagination. And on the other hand, you have this saving the way of our life, which is about populism, right-wing ideals about the future. So there's two different versions of future clashing, and one of which is Eastern European more, and the other is Western European. So this East-West divide, is it still there? And considering the fact that energy crisis and everything that we are going through, this saving life, that dictum, is it still there? Or which one?
No, listen, we all of the time, first of all, I very much believe that this type of two trends. One is we're afraid because our way of life is going to be destroyed. There are not going to be any Bulgarians in the world anymore. There are not going to be any Poles in the world anymore. And on the other, they're not going to be the world anymore because the earth is going to disappear. But they have two totally different moral imperatives to people. If I fear about our way of life, about my own community, I want basically my wife and I to have 5 kids. If I believe that the world is overburdened and there are too many people and so on, I want to have no kids. And this strange story in which for the younger people, you really kind of clashed between two very different apocalyptic views of what is ending. First, what is typical for both of these views is that future is perceived as a threat. We are not dreaming future, we are nightmaring future. And this is what I found totally unacceptable, both with type of absolutization of the climate crisis and absolutization of the demographic crisis, is that society should learn again how to basically get into love with the future. If we don't know how to get excited by the future, if we don't know how to start dating the future again, I do believe we are in a self-defeating position. Nevertheless, we go for a climate absolutism or demographic absolutism. And by the way, both issues are real in a certain way. Climate is a real problem and we should do things about this. But behaving like last man or like a last Bulgarian is not going to help us. Thank you.
I mean, I completely agree. This politics of hope that we used to have, even though the world was really not a nice place to live, even back then in 30, 40 years ago, completely disappeared. And now we have this old visions of future are apocalyptic, dystopian. and without any sort of hope. Probably that's one of the basic things that we as societies became just depressed without any political solution in this and that. So one final question from the audience is a completely different subject. It's about China, something that we haven't addressed. Maybe we can talk a little bit about China and then close this session. And the question is, China being the US's priority over Russia prior to Ukraine and Russia's war, how the war will have an impact or change China's posture in economic and security realms?
It's a great question. And I should confess that I'm not the great China expert that you have invited for your global politics talks. China is in a difficult position. Of course, China does not want Russia to lose. On the other side, this war put under question one of the basic kind of characters of the China foreign policy, mainly the stress on sovereignty, which was critically important, and it was very much popular in the third world. From this point of view, when people talk Taiwan being the same like Ukraine, this is not true. Ukraine is a sovereign, recognized country by everybody, and even the United States, with their one China policy, to some extent recognized Taiwan being as part of China. China is also very much pressed to understand that it's not simply that they want probably to help Russia in one way or the other, but they should be very careful how they're doing this. Because if the secondary sanctions are going to come, the economic war is also going to have a high cost for them in the moment in which the economy is quite vulnerable. So this is also rebalancing. Listen, Americans are taking their risk too. Because what people are learning out of sanctioning the currency reserves of the Russian central bank is, if you're in bad relations with the US, are you really going to keep in dollars assets? But if you're not going to keep it in dollars, in what? Turkish lira is also not a great option. So from this point of view, I do believe that one of the interesting stories, and I want to end on this, all these wars are very pedagogical. All participants want to teach a lesson to somebody. President Putin wanted to teach lessons to the Ukrainians, but also to the West. Americans want to teach a lesson to the Russians, but also to the Chinese. And Chinese also want to teach a lesson, but before they should decide what of the lessons they want to learn. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ivan.
This was such a stimulating discussion, and we had too much input from the audience. Many great questions, and thank you so much for joining us, being here with us. Thank you, everyone. And,
thank you very much. These days, it's much more difficult to be an audience than to be a speaker.
So
I'm really grateful to the people who joined.
Thank you.
Yeah, see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So.